Welcome to another episode of TGT Talks, hosted by me, Melissa.
And me, Desiree.
Where the goal is to empower the youth of Glendale and connect youth to the community resources, individuals, and organizations through interviews and discussions.
And today we are joined by special guest, Duncan Tonatiuh. Duncan is an award-winning author-illustrator. He is both Mexican and American. He grew up in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, and graduated from Parsons School of Design and Eugene College in New York City. His artwork is inspired by pre-Columbian art, particularly that of the Mixtec codices. His aim is to create images and stories that honor the past, but that are relevant to people, especially children, nowadays.
Don't forget to follow us on our socials on Instagram and Facebook at MyGlendaleLAC. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and Apple or wherever you listen to your podcast at TGT Talks. Also, make sure to give us a like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Glendale Library Arts and Culture, where we post full videos every Friday at 4:30 p.m. Thank you, Duncan, for taking the time out of your day to talk with us. We have a lot to discuss.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So to start off the interview, was art always a part of your life since growing up, or did you find the passion for it later on?
I found it pretty early on. I got both interested in writing and illustrating when I was about 7, 8 years old. And so what happened is that I was born in Mexico City. But then when my family was, when I was about 7, 8, we moved to a smaller city called San Miguel de Allende in central Mexico. It's a very pretty city. But when I moved, I didn't know a lot of the kids in my neighborhood. I didn't know the kids at my school. This was before everyone had smartphones. The internet was not ubiquitous. And we didn't have a TV because my family had sold all these things when we moved. So I would borrow a lot of books from my school library. They had these Choose Your Own Adventure series of little chapter books that I liked. And I would read one, and a few days later, I would take it back and read another one. And that's when I first became interested in writing, because I thought, well, I discovered reading for the fun of it. And then I thought maybe I could be a writer someday. And when I had assignments at my school that had to do with writing, we had to write a story, and they'd be like, write 2 pages. I would write like 10, I would like get really excited, really into it. But that's when I first thought about when the idea of first being a writer kind of came into my mind. And about that same time, soon after I moved to San Miguel, my some cousins of mine from Mexico City came to visit me and my family, and they brought a bunch of comic books. Like Spider-Man and X-Men, and I'd never seen comics, so I was really excited by them. I began saving my allowance to buy my own comics. But then over summer break, over winter break, when we were on vacation, the cousins, we would usually get together at my grandma's house in Mexico City and spend our holidays there. And we would read comics, we would exchange them, but we would also try and imagine our own superheroes, our own supervillains, grab old notebooks, piece of paper, and draw our own stories. And that's when I began drawing. I just kind of kept doing it. My interest changed a little bit throughout the years. But that's when I first became interested in both writing and drawing, when I was in elementary school, like in 2nd, 3rd grade.
So you also went to school in New York City. What was that transition like, going from your hometown to a big city?
Yeah, so I'm both Mexican and American. My mom was Mexican, but my father's American. He was born in the US, and he came down to Mexico in 1969 with his hippie buddies. He had a big beard and, long hair, drove a VW van, and he was supposed to be in Mexico for like a month, and 50 years later, he's still here. But I'm a dual citizen, because even though I was born in Mexico, because my father's American, I'm also American citizen, and I have family in both countries. And I did elementary school, middle school in San Miguel. I did a year of high school, but I didn't like my high school. I wasn't happy there. And I had a cousin of mine that had gone to a high school in Massachusetts that he really liked because it was very arts oriented. And he thought I might like it because he knew that I liked drawing and writing. And so I ended up going to this school in Massachusetts, this small school in Massachusetts, where I did a lot of artwork. It's a school called Buxton. It's a boarding school, actually, but very small, very co-ed, very arts oriented. And I really enjoyed it. I was very happy there. And by the time I was a teenager, I was confident that I wanted to do pursue a career in the arts. And so that's why I applied to an art school, to a design school in New York. I went to Parsons School of Design, and I decided to go there. It's a school that's very famous for fashion. But the reason why I wanted to go to Parsons is because I wanted to do art, but Parsons is part of the new school. And so I could also take a lot of writing classes at Eugene Land College, which is sort of Parsons' sister school. And so I went there and I really enjoyed it. But what happened is that, I came to the US when I was about 15 years old. And as I spent more time in the US, I began to miss things. The food, the music, different traditions that were always around me growing up in Mexico. And I just kind of started becoming more interested in the art of Mexico and the culture of Mexico, especially when I was in college and I had different assignments. If I was able to, I would connect them to my Mexican background, my Mexican culture somehow. I remember I had a photography class that I took, and I decided to photograph this big march, this immigrant protest that was happening, because I became interested in issues that affect people of Mexican origin on both sides of the border. Or I took a fiction writing class, and I decided to try and write a short story that was set in San Miguel. And so that's sort of, I was very happy when I came to the US. I wasn't sort of shocked, because I was in very supportive environments. The boarding school I went to was, they were very arts oriented, very supportive. And then when I was in New York, there was a lot of art around. I liked my classes. But I definitely began to miss things about Mexico, and that really and that really sort of inspired my work. My last year in college, I had to have a senior thesis, a senior project, and I wanted to do something with writing, with illustrating, and I had taken a class called community organizing, and because of it, I met a friend at this worker center, a friend named Sergio, who is Mixtec. And Mixtec is an indigenous group from southern Mexico, but there's a lot of Mixtecs that have migrated to different parts of the US. And so I thought that maybe for my senior project, I could do something about his journey from this small village in Mexico to now being in this large city in the US. And he had fought for better working conditions, even though he was undocumented. And so I thought that story would be could make a good project. And I wanted to do something with writing, with drawing, maybe some kind of comic book, graphic novel. And when I decided that that was gonna be my project, one of the first things I did was go to my university's library and look up Mixtec artwork. And in books, I found these kinds of images. These are drawings that the Mixtec people made, because there's modern day Mixtecs, but the Mixtecs were also a civilization like the Aztecs, like the Maya, and they made books. They made these books that are very long. They fold out like accordions, and they have a very stylized way of drawing. Everyone's always in profile. The way they draw hands, the way they draw ears is very unique. And so for my project, I actually have a copy here of my senior project. I called it Journey of a Mixteco. That's when I began drawing like that. Here's the book about my friend Sergio, and it folds out like that, like an accordion. And I started drawing in that kind of Mixtec, that's Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian art style. But yeah, so when I kind of coming to the US really kind of influenced me and wanting to kind of connect with my Mexican culture and my Mexican background.
Your time in college, what did you learn, I guess, specifically about art and all that stuff that you kind of, took with you into your, professional career?
Well, several things. I mean, one thing that I miss from being a student, I mean, it was challenging being a student at times because I didn't have money, so that and I had to do a lot of odd jobs and different things. But I had a lot of it was a great opportunity to like experiment and try different things out. I didn't always draw in this style. Like now I've made my 14th book is coming out, and I've been doing them in this kind of Mixtec Mesoamerican style. But when I was in college, it was a great opportunity to try different things out. And, like I said, I took photography class, I took writing classes, I took, social studies. I took a lot of different things to try and figure out what I was interested in. And even after I graduated, you know, when I was working on this book, another great thing was making connections, you know, because when I was working on this project, like we were in the middle semester and we had to put our artwork up on the walls. And there were different teachers that came and look at what we were working on. And they weren't my teachers, but they were professors at the university that were guests at our class to give us feedback. And one of the professors really thought that what I was doing was interesting. And she had illustrated some children's books. And she said, have you ever thought of doing children's books? Which I had never considered until then. You know, since I was a teenager, I wanted to be an artist, but I always thought of doing art for adults. You know, I never really considered doing art for younger readers. And she introduced me to this editor that she was friends with. And, you know, he saw my project and he said, you know, this book that you're making it's interesting, but the way it folds is kind of weird. This is more for older readers. I do books for younger readers. And I told him I like writing. Maybe I could write a picture book for you. And he told me some kind of very basic things about picture books, that they're usually 32 pages long. He said, you know, maybe make your protagonist an animal or a child, someone that young people can identify with. And then I tried writing a story, and it was the first picture book I ever wrote. You know, so I wrote in my notebook, I typed in my computer, and because it was the first one I ever wrote, I thought I should make a rhyme like Dr. Seuss. And I sent it to his editor. It was this story about these two cousins, one that lives in a rural community in Mexico, one that lives in an urban center in the US. And they send letters back and forth about their everyday experiences. And I sent to the editor and said, you know, I think this story could make a good book. I think you would do a good job illustrating it, but no rhyming, please. Your rhymes are not very good. And so I had to revise it, you know, but eventually it became my first published book. And it's something that happens with all my books, you know, it never comes out perfect the first time. I always have to revisit my work. It's this one. This was actually my first published book, Dear Primo, a letter to my cousin. And it's inspired by kind of, you know, sort of growing up in Mexico, but then also seeing kind of kids in the US, especially in New York, and sometimes some of the way they dress, some of the games they played, you know. And it's about the differences, but it's also about the similarities, you know, because maybe one cousin likes to play football and the other one likes basketball, but they both like sports. You know, one likes quesadillas, the other one likes pizza, but they both like cheesy food, spending time with their friends, with their family. And so I hope that's the message of the book. But sorry, I digressed a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think two big things that I got out of college. One was it was an opportunity to experiment and to learn, obviously, try different things out, kind of find my voice. I really feel that it was an opportunity to try things out and find my illustration style, my voice of what I wanted to make my work about. And then it was also a great place to make connections, especially being in New York was super helpful. Like this editor that I met, his office was like 7 blocks away from where I went to school. So one day after school, I literally walked over there to meet with him. And, you know, I was taking classes with working professionals. That was also really great because they knew people in the business and had a lot of great insight and feedback. So those are two things that I really got out of school.
And what about children's books did you fall in love with, like during, you know, the process of creating your first one? What made you want to stay in that avenue of the children's world?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of things. I mean, one of the first thing, you know, like I said, I didn't think of doing children's books till I had pretty much almost graduated from college. But now that I do it, I can't imagine doing something differently. And there's a lot of things that I like about it. One is I get to write and illustrate, which are these two interests that I've had since I was a kid. Another thing is I feel like books for young readers, for children, they don't need to be happy, but I do think they need to be positive. They need to be hopeful. Like I think sometimes artwork for adults or, you know, yeah, whether it's novels or movies, art or whatnot, can be a little kind of, I can't think of the right word, but a little like dark, you know, the world is terrible, the end kind of thing, you know? And I think when you're making books for young readers, like some of my books have tackled challenging subjects, immigration, segregation, but I still want them to have like a positive message in some way, have a hopeful message in some way. So that's another thing that I really enjoy about making books for young readers. And yeah, and I mean, I feel very lucky, I think another thing that I enjoy is that you have to be very kind of immediate, so to speak, like if you read a novel for adults, you may wait 30, 40 pages and be like, I'm not sure about this book kind of thing. But a kid is not going to read, more than a few pages before he gets kind of like bored with it. So you got to capture their attention quick. And I like that challenge. That's one thing I like about them. And I feel very lucky because in my book's been an opportunity to share things that I care about and also to learn about things that I want to learn more about. So for example, my latest book, it's actually not a physical book yet. It'll be out in November. It's going to be called A Land of Books. These are kind of the proofs that I get to make sure the colors look right. But it's about the Tlahuiloque, the people that painted these codices, these books that were made in pre-Columbian times. People like the Mixtecs, the Mexica or Aztecs, the Maya made these books. And I've been inspired by this kind of artwork for a long time, but I thought I should know more about this. I should learn more about this. And because I'm an author and illustrator, I get to dive into a subject that I want to learn more about, care about, and try and find a way to turn it into a picture book. So that's another thing that I love about it. And one more thing that I want to mention is that, like when I began making books, when I made like my senior project, like a lot of it was because I missed things from Mexico, and it was sort of a way to connect with my culture, my background. But as I started doing more books, I came to learn about the need for multicultural literature and the need for more diversity in children's books. Like in the US, there's thousands of books that get published for young readers every year, but only a small amount of them or a small percentage of them are about, Latino, Latina children, African-American children, Asian-American children. Even though there's so many different kinds of kids in the US, the books that are available don't really reflect that, and I think it's very important for people to see themselves in books. I think it lets them know that their stories are important. I think it's important to read about people that are different than yourselves. I think that can also be important as a way to have less prejudice towards others, to kind of build bridges between different communities, different cultures, different religions. I think reading and books can be a way to do that. So that's another reason why I'm very interested in making multicultural books, and very, very committed to doing that, and why I want to continue doing it.
What is something that helps you keep your creativity flowing?
That's a good question. I mean, there's different stages when I'm making a book, and so when I'm first starting to write, even if it's a fiction story, even if it's not like non-fiction, even if it's a story that I make up, it usually involves some kind of research, and that can sometimes be like reading a lot of books, like for example, I've done like I did a book called The Princess and the Warrior a few years ago. And I wanted to do, before I wrote that book, I wanted to do something that was kind of like a fairy tale, but like try and make it a little more modern. And so I thought of different stories, and I read a lot of fairy tales. That was sort of kind of like trying to get inspiration, kind of trying to sort of absorb that a little. And then I tried different things out. I thought maybe I could do like Puss in Boots, but instead of boots, he's like wears sneakers and he's in a city, and I tried to change a few things, but it wasn't that original. And then I thought, well, maybe I could do something like Hansel and Gretel. There'll be Juan y Greta, and it'll be like, like spicy Mexican candy in the house or something. But then it wasn't that different or that original. And then I thought of Sleeping Beauty, and that made me think of the sleeping woman. And then that made me think of La Mujer Dormida and the legend of the volcanoes, Iztaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl, because there's this volcano that's kind of shaped like a sleeping woman, and there's this legend about how they came to be and why they're shaped like that. But so that's something that I often do, that often ends up happening. You know, I'll read a lot, I'll look at a lot of different art before, when I first have an idea for a project, before I actually start drawing. Once I start actually drawing and writing, sometimes I can get a little bit stuck. And when that happens is I like going for a walk. Sometimes when I go for a walk, I can kind of, you know, I can be like, oh, if I turn around this drawing this way, or if I start the story from here or tell it from this voice, that can sometimes help sort of unblock the creativity. And then once I, you know, like to make my art, I draw on pieces of paper. And then I scan my drawings, and sometimes you'll see that kind of different pieces are in different parts, and then I kind of paste them together in the computer. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I collage a lot of textures into my drawings. That's why some parts of the book look very realistic. And when I do that, and if you want, maybe I can even show you how I do it on the computer. Like it takes me a lot of time, but I don't have to think as much. And so when I first start like writing and drawing, I have to be very quiet. That's kind of when I can get stuck a little. Once I have most of the story figured out, most of the sketches figured out, and I put texture and color into them, it takes me a long time to do, but I don't have to think as much. So when I'm doing that, I can listen to music, I can have news on TV or sports or something. But when I'm first writing and drawing, I like going to the library or the park, somewhere that's hopefully very quiet.
Your first book project to your most recent one, how have you seen, I guess, your growth change, or even maybe your process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you know, there's sort of different small things that I've tried out in different books that now I kind of know, that are kind of now part of my, I don't know what to call it, toolkit, so to speak. So for example, in a previous book that I did about the Day of the Dead, I used a lot of borders. And so then when in other books now, I've tried to use that again sometimes, you know, because it's something that I've done. One thing that I think I've kind of become more aware of is how different parts of the book work with one another. Let me grab a book really quick to give you an example. So a couple of years ago, I did this book called Feather Serpent and the Five Sons. And it's about the god Quetzalcoatl, and there's this legend of how he goes to the underworld to recuperate these sacred bones of creation. And so in the story, when he does that, when he goes to Mictlan, to the underworld, he has to go through all these different regions to get there. Like there's this river that he has to cross, these mountains, these boulders that clash against one another, these this obsidian mountain, this place where it snows and it's very cold, a place where there are these strong winds, a place where it rains arrows, a place where jaguars want to devour you, eat your heart. And he has to cross a river again, and there's this large reptile at the bottom there until he finally gets to Mictlan, to where Mictlantecutli, the god of the underworld, dwells. And there's different things that he does to overcome these different challenges. But one thing, I don't know if you notice, is that it starts kind of full color. And by the time that we get to this page, it's grayscale. And there's sort of like a transition in the pages that you start kind of losing color as he kind of goes deeper and deeper into Mictlan. So that, for example, is one thing that I've tried to think about a lot more in my later books, is how different pages of the book work with one another, not just kind of the composition within a page, but sort of like the overall design of the book.
So what do you think has been like the hardest challenge in this whole journey, and like what have you taken away from it all?
Well, I mean, getting started was challenging. Like I was very lucky that right after I graduated, I had this opportunity of doing my first book, Dear Primo. And then after that, I wrote a different story and I sent to this editor. that I knew. And he was like, I'm not sure about this story. I had assumed everything that I wrote would become a book. And then I sent something else and sent it to some other people. And that's when I got a lot more rejection. To get my second book published, I had a lot more rejections. And because people didn't really know my work, I wasn't able to make a living from just that. So I did a lot of other odd jobs. I was like a wedding photographer assistant for a while. I did different things to kind of pay the bills. But I kept at it and I published more books, and eventually now it's something that I can do for a living. That's what I dedicate all my time to. But kind of getting started was hard, kind of getting to that point where I could do that. And then the other thing, I know it's kind of part of the process now, but it still can be a little stressful. I'll write something and I'm very happy, and then I'll share it with an editor and they're like, we don't know about this, or they'll say, okay, this sounds like an interesting story, but, and I'll be like full of cross things out, comments in the margins. I don't understand this. Can you explain this a little better? Maybe we should cut this. Maybe you should think of a different ending. I always have to revise my work. And that can be a little frustrating at times because, I've been putting all this time into it. But I trust my editor. I've been working actually for most of my books, all the books that I've written and illustrated, that I'm the author and illustrator. I've worked with the same editor, and he's been doing it for a long time. He's worked with a lot of other authors, so he has a lot of insight and can see things about a book that sometimes I can be a little sort of attached to kind of notice. But it still can be a little challenging doing that. I think one thing I feel I should mention is, like, I feel very lucky. People have been very supportive of my book. Some of them have received awards. There's a lot of, I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of schools, speak at different places. One thing that I really enjoy is when students create maybe artwork that's inspired by my art or by my books, or sometimes they've done like a little play, different things, different projects. But this last year, there's been sort of something different, which is the whole book bans. And one of my books has been, they've tried to ban it in a couple places. This book called Separate is Never Equal, which is a story about about Silvia and her family, another Latino family, other Mexican-American family in California in the 40s that weren't allowed to go to school with white children. And they were sent to a separate school. And this is a true story. But they filed a lawsuit, and eventually they won this case. And that helped, that paved the way and sort of helped desegregate schools in California. And so I think it's a very positive story, showing sort of kids that it takes people to be courageous, to take action. But there's been people that are against the book in different parts of the country. Some people that don't think it's appropriate because they say it makes white children feel bad or Mexican children feel bad. And I disagree completely. Like what I was saying before, is that one of the reasons that I like to make books is that I think they need to have a hopeful message, a positive message. In this book, the last spread in the book is actually like, children playing together. And when I've shown this book to students, the thing that they get out of it is that they see the injustice in the story, and they don't think that that's right, and they don't think that that's how you should treat people. But there are some parents, some moms that don't think the book is appropriate. And so that's been challenging. That's been frustrating. And it's not just my books. There's a lot of books in the country right now, especially books that deal with race or gender, that are being banned from classrooms. And I think it's something terrible. I think it's totally politically motivated. I think it's fine for people to not like a book, to not read a book, to criticize a book. I don't pretend that my books are perfect or that I'm perfect in any way. But this whole idea of like prohibiting people from reading them and not allowing people to kind of read them for themselves and make their own minds, I think is, I just don't agree with that.
And for you, what does all of this mean to you, especially being both Mexican and American and being able to share your story and, culture through books?
Yeah, I mean, I feel super lucky, it's something that I enjoy. And, earlier I was mentioning, I mean, there's this whole theory of books as windows and as mirrors and windows, that books it's important to see yourself in books. And I really believe that. Like some years ago, I made a book called Pancho Rabbit and the Coyote. And the book is, it's a fable with animals that talk, but it's also an allegory of the dangers that migrants sometimes go through to reach the US. So the coyote in the story, it's like, it can be like a wolf, like a dog that lives in the desert, but it's also slang for a person that smuggles people between the US-Mexico border. So with the book, you can read it in both ways. You can read it just as a story with animals, or you can imagine that the animals represent people. And, soon after I made that book, I was invited to a book festival in Texas, at the Texas Book Festival. And there was, they had a tent, and every 30 minutes, a different author would read from their book and answer a few questions, and then a different author would come in. But every time an author spoke, there was a group of students that would introduce him. And these students introduced me. They said a few things about me. And then they said, and now we want to share this multi-voice poem we wrote. And it was this poem that they wrote. They made a video of it, but it was about their own border crossing experiences. And it's a very moving video. And I just thought, that really kind of, for me, that really confirmed this idea of books as mirrors, that I thought that, because they saw these kinds of stories told in a book, they said, our stories are important, our voices are important, we can talk about this, like, we should talk about this. And so I think that's one thing that I feel lucky and that I hope the books will do. Like I said, especially because there is such a, there's so many Mexican American, Latinx children in the US, but the amount of books don't really reflect, there's such a small amount of books, even though it's such a large community, such a big part of the US. So hopefully more children will be able to see themselves. And, like I was saying before, I think it can also be an opportunity to learn about someone else's experience. This book is my most popular book, Separate is Never Equal, even though it's been banned, or they're trying to ban it in some places. It's the book that people know me the most for. And I think it is because people kind of recognize the importance of the story, and differently people from other communities. Sometimes we think that the civil rights is something that only had to do with Black people, with African-American people. But there are different communities that have been marginalized and have experienced different injustices throughout the years, and different people that have fought for a better society. And so I think books can be a way to learn about others also. And so I feel very lucky that by making books, I hopefully that's the effect that the books have.
So before we end, we have some rapid fire questions. The first question is, what is your favorite color?
Green.
When are you the happiest?
When I'm reading books with my kids.
Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
Don't take yourself so seriously.
If you could have 3 people, dead or alive, for dinner guests, who would they be?
Maybe like Guadalupe Posada. There's an author I really like, Juan Rulfo. Who else? I really like a photographer named Cartier-Bresson. I don't know. There were so many different artists that I would love to pick their brain.
What do you want your legacy to be?
A great bookmaker, a great picture bookmaker. I think like picture books are their own format because they combine words and pictures. And I want to keep on doing it and hopefully getting better and better at it.
What is a book that you have recently read or are currently reading that you would recommend?
One that I read recently, it was a few months ago, but that I read with my kids is this one, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon by Grace Lin. And I really enjoyed it. And I know I like a book a lot because it makes me want to write. And after I read this book, I wanted to write, I tried writing a novel when I was in college, but I haven't attempted it much since. But after I read this book, I was like, it gave me ideas of a chapter book, of a novel that I could write. So this is one that I really enjoyed and that my kids really enjoyed. And a book that this is for more for adults, but it's one of the books that I really enjoy, by Juan Rulfo. He's very famous for these two books, Pedro Páramo, and another one called El Llano en Llamas. The Pedro Páramo is a novel, and El Llano en Llamas is a collection of short stories. And he was an author that really made me want to write, because when I read his book, he writes a lot in the first person, very vernacular language. So when you read the stories, you feel like someone's just talking to you. And I don't think I had encountered that in books, or at least I hadn't paid attention to it. But after I read his stories, I wanted to try and write a story like that, where someone's talking to you, the way they sound, about, these stories take place in rural Mexico in the 20s or something. I wanted to do something that's taking place now and whatnot, but taking that idea of something that sounds like someone's like right next to you telling you the story. So he's a wonderful author, and I really recommend him, Juan Rulfo.
Well, thank you so much, Duncan. We learned a lot about you. Thank you for taking your time out of the day to sit down and talk with us. Can you let everyone at home know about any upcoming projects and where they could connect with you?
Yeah, so my latest book will be available in November. It's this one, A Land of Books. So keep your eye out on it. I'm very, very happy with how it turned out. I have a website, which is just my name, Duncan or Duncan. In Spanish, I pronounce my name Duncan. So just my name, Duncan or Duncan Tonatiuh.com. And I'm on Facebook and on Twitter. And I'm too old now to be on Instagram. It's like another password and stuff to remember, because I don't know what the kids are using these days, but that's what I have. I have a Twitter account, which is just @Duncan Tonatiuh, and you can also find me on Facebook.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. And we really appreciate having you. And thank you so much again for doing this. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.